Sometimes the course of our lives can change in the blink of an eye, and it's not always down to the actions we ourselves take. Often, our lives are influenced catastrophically by the decisions that those around us make. Their actions, whether deliberate or not, can have such a devastational impact upon us that it can change the outcome of our lives in a heartbeat. And today's case is a prime example of this. A vile person's actions, committed in mere seconds, causes such a shocking and traumatic situation that it leads to a life-changing and ultimately life-ending outcome. Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if your idea of heaven is watching true crime 24/7, welcome to the club. You're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready because it's time for more true crime. In the early morning of the 23rd of September 2015, the course of a man's life would be rerouted completely in the space of seconds due to the actions of a jealous, deceitful and hateful individual whose plan to hurt, maim and devastate was put into action in the blink of an eye. At approximately 2:50 AM, Mark van Dongen was awoken suddenly by a loud and high-pitched laugh. Startled, he lifted his head from the pillow and looked around the darkened room, trying to figure out where the laugh was coming from. Suddenly, he heard the words, "If I can't have you, no one else can." And in that moment, his life was turned upside down forever by a person who only hours earlier had claimed to love him. Just minutes later, Thomas Sweet was alerted by what he described as the sound of foxes fighting in the street outside. At the same time, in the same street, Dr. Nicola White was woken up by the sound of someone outside screaming. Cautiously, the pair opened the doors and peered outside, hoping to figure out what the commotion could be. Tentatively, they walked out into the street to investigate the situation further. It was then that they were met with a scene that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. There, in the street, was Mark van Dongen, screaming and writhing in agony, begging for help from the pair and shouting, in between screams of pain, "She did it to me in there, she did it to me," as he pointed at an open door in the street. Belinda Wallace, a fashion student and South African native who was living in Bristol after having moved there with an ex-husband, had been in a long-term relationship of 5 years with Mark van Dongen, a student living in the Netherlands, after the pair met online in 2010 on a dating site that was set up to help those with HIV meet and connect. Belinda, who had contracted HIV through what she had described as gang violence when she was younger, and Mark, who had contracted it from a short-term fling, had hit it off well at first, despite the large age gap of 18 years between them. And eventually, in January 2011, Mark decided to travel to meet Belinda, with the pair eventually deciding to take the next step and move in together in Belinda's flat in Ladysmith Road, Bristol, resulting in Mark moving from his home in the Netherlands and continuing his studies at Bristol University, where he eventually graduated and went on to find work as an engineer in the construction industry. And things, it seemed at first, were going well. They enjoyed each other's company, bounced off of one another, and both felt as if they had a great start together as a couple. However, when Mark took Belinda to meet his family, his father, Cornelius, didn't exactly feel great about the relationship. He said that he had the impression she was using him and that he wasn't sure about the relationship, but that Mark was in love with her, even if he didn't feel as if she was quite as in love with him. Despite feeling as if something wasn't quite right, Cornelius made the effort to build a relationship with Belinda for his son's sake, explaining that he always treated her as if she was his own daughter, mentioning that she always called him Papa Kess, and describing that he had always been very good with her. In public, the relationship was seen as a normal, everyday relationship, but Behind closed doors, the relationship between the pair was described as turbulent, with friends of Mark describing it as increasingly abusive. It was said that as time in the relationship went on, Belinda became more and more verbally abusive, and sometimes physically abusive too. It was noted that in October 2011, Wallace had flipped into a violent rage and doused Mark with boiling water, resulting in him needing to seek treatment for the burns, telling the doctors that the injuries were from spilling a cup of tea over himself. Mark's friends also began noticing scratches on his body on other occasions, with Mark often showing his friends the injuries that Wallace would inflict upon him. Belinda, who was studying fashion at university, also refused to get a job, expecting Mark to support her financially, as well as send money back to her family in South Africa on regular occasions. And on top of what seems like physical and financial abuse, she would also abuse Mark mentally, with reports of her regularly telling Mark that she would harm herself if he were ever to leave her, and that she would make it look as if he had been the one to harm her, and that she would then report him for doing so. It truly seemed that the relationship between the pair was doomed from relatively early on, and by August of 2015, the relationship had completely begun to break down, with the cracks that had appeared over the years by this point in time beginning to look like chasms. It seemed that after years of enduring the physical and mental abuse that came with the relationship with Belinda, Mark decided that he could endure no more, and he made the decision to leave her, fully committing to his decision by moving out of their shared home and taking up refuge in a hotel, agreeing, however, to still help Belinda pay the bills and also agreeing to give her money to live. After realising that he would never be happy with Belinda and the abuse that came with the relationship, Mark made a strong effort to move on and leave life with Miss Wallace behind. He did this by getting back out there into the dating market, where he met a woman called Violet Farquharson online. After talking online and then meeting for a coffee, Mark and Miss Farquharson hit it off, and their relationship began to grow. Unfortunately for Mark, however, this would only serve to worsen Belinda's abusive behaviour. As is often the case with narcissists, Belinda reacted badly to the rejection she felt from Mark, using increasingly alarming behaviour to try and emotionally blackmail Mark into returning to their relationship and resuming the status quo. On August the 20th, Mark tells Violet that Wallace had attacked him, and on the 21st of August, he calls 999 to inform them that Wallace had taken an overdose. On August the 23rd, Mark receives a number of threatening text messages, and on August the 27th, Wallace tells the therapist that she feels depressed, angry, betrayed, and anxious. Then, on August the 28th, Wallace begins to make silent phone calls to Miss Farquharson, with September the 1st being the final of a total of 14 silent calls to Violet at 9:45 a.m. At 3:02 p.m, she then emails Mark to say that her ex-husband has had a heart attack. And on September the 2nd, at 8:12 p.m, Mark calls the police to report that Belinda is harassing him and his girlfriend. She had been sending him a barrage of messages and calls, trying to get him to contact her, and Mark was becoming sick and tired of the constant barrage coming his way. He asked them to get her to stop harassing him and Violet. On September the 3rd, at 7:09 p.m, police inform Wallace of Mark's call, and police warn Wallace, under the Protection from Harassment Act, to stop contacting the pair. She was also told that any future contact could lead to her arrest. At 7:35 p.m. that night, she calls a mental health crisis team, reporting that she has taken an overdose, with an ambulance coming to take her to hospital, where she is cared for and then released the next day. The pattern of escalating behaviour is substantial, and this is only half of it. The physical and mental abuse that Wallace dished out towards Mark and Violet was unrelenting, but sadly, the worst was yet to come. As time had gone on, Mark had become more and more worried about Wallace's escalating behaviour and threats to commit. As he had communicated in the past to the police and others, he had only ever stayed with her out of pity and a feeling of duty of care towards her, and it seemed that this feeling of pity had reared its head again. By September the 23rd, it was thought that Mark was once again planning to try and make his relationship with Wallace work. After having had a conversation with Violet, explaining how he was worried about Wallace and explaining the fact that he felt he had a duty of care towards her, and how he felt guilty that she was self-harming due to the fact that he had left the relationship. At approximately 10 p.m. that night, he left Violet's flat, not knowing that in just a matter of hours, this decision would turn out to be completely life-altering for him and Miss Wallace. Upon arriving at the home of Wallace, it is reported that the pair had spoken, and although at some point they had confessed their love for one another, things had taken a turn for the worse and had escalated into an argument, with Wallace leaving the flat and telling Mark she was going to stay at a hotel. Feeling like nothing more could be done to rectify the situation, Mark had then decided to go to bed, feeling that a good night's sleep might help rectify things in the morning. At approximately 2:50 a.m, Mark Van Dongen was awoken from his sleep suddenly by a loud and high-pitched laugh. Startled, he lifted his head from the pillow and looked around the darkened room, trying to figure out where the laugh was coming from. Suddenly, he heard the words, "If I can't have you, no one else can," and then Mark felt something wet cover his face, arms and chest. He realised in an instant that Belinda had returned to the flat and had doused him with something that was beginning to cause him a world of pain and hurt. Instantly, he is hit with a burning and stinging sensation across his face, arms and upper body. He can feel the substance burning into his skin, eyes and ears, the pain becoming more and more unbearable with each passing second. Quickly, he begins to lose the sight in his eyes, and before doing so, jumps out of the bed, runs out of the door, and while screaming in agony, makes his way outside to try and find someone to help him and take away the extreme pain that he is experiencing. As he does so, Belinda simply picks up her phone, walks over to the couch, and sits down calmly, not even giving Mark a second thought after what she had just done. Just minutes later, Thomas Sweet was alerted by what he described as the sound of foxes fighting in the street outside. At the same time, in the same street, Dr. Nicola White was woken up by the sound of someone outside screaming for help. Cautiously, the pair opened their doors and peered outside, hoping to figure out what the commotion could be. Tentatively, they walked out into the street to investigate the situation further, following the noise as they did. As they moved closer, they could hear a man screaming out, help me, I need a shower, help me, I'm going to effing die." At first, they thought it could be someone who was simply confused due to having been using drugs, but when the screams of pain and cries for help continued, they realised that something was severely wrong. Suddenly, they caught a glimpse of Mark. At this point, multiple people, including Miss White and Mr. Sweet, had come to Mark's aid, with some of the group calling for an ambulance and the rest ushering Mark into a nearby flat to help him have a shower, to try and wash the substance that covered his skin from his body. As he passed the door to the home of Wallace, he pointed and said, "She did it to me in there, she did it to me." Still, he writhed in agony and pain, as the substance had burnt into his skin deeper and deeper. It had begun to affect the muscles and bones of his body, with witnesses describing him as looking like he was covered in what looked like mud or deep red paint. Little did they know, this was his own skin burning and falling from his body. As the people around him tried to help wash the substance off of Mark, they commented that he was babbling and moaning, saying, "My ex did this, my ex did this." At 3:05 a.m, paramedics and police arrived at the scene to find that Mark was suffering from chemical burns across his face, arms, chest, stomach and thighs. The paramedic noted that he was foaming at the mouth and crying out that he couldn't see. He then asked paramedics if he still had eyelids. One of the police on scene also observed that Mark's eyes looked grey and bloodshot, and as if his irises had melted away. Mark was quickly placed in the ambulance and transported to Southmead Hospital. On the way, he was given pain medication that, although didn't help much, took the edge off enough for him to momentarily point to a tattoo on his stomach of Berliner's name, while saying, "She needs to go to prison for this." At the same time as Mark was being seen to by paramedics, police entered the home of Miss Wallace, and upon asking what she had thrown over Mark, her reply was acid. "I was using it to distress some fabric." She then indicated to the glass, cloth and paintbrush on the floor. Next, she took police to a cabinet and showed them a clear plastic bottle that looked about 1/4 full. She acknowledged that it was sulfuric acid and that this is what she had thrown over Mark. It was at this point that she was arrested and taken into custody. At 3:16 a.m, Mark arrived at Southmead Hospital and was taken to a specialist burns unit at the site. Here, he caught a glimpse of his reflection and exclaimed, "Kill me now! If my face is going to be left looking like this, I don't want to live." In the hospital, Mark was placed into an induced coma as doctors and nurses strived to save him and save what function they could of his body. At the same time, police were trying hard to locate Mark's family, and due to the fact that they lived in Belgium, it took 10 days to find his father, who, upon hearing what had happened to his son, rushed to his bedside. Upon arriving at the hospital and being directed to his son, Cornelius van Dongen walked around the ward in search of him, but upon being able to locate him, went back to the doctor to ask again where his son was, believing that they had accidentally given him the wrong directions, only to be shocked by the fact that they took him over to the very first person who he had walked past, realizing that he simply hadn't recognized his own son due to the extensive injuries. "We entered the ward," he said. "There were 6 rooms, one next to another. We looked in every room, and we looked at every person in every bed. At first I said, 'There's been a mistake. Mark is not here.' The doctor arrived and told me my son was in room 1, the first room I had looked in. I failed to recognize my own son. His injuries were unbelievable." Mark spent 4 months in a coma in intensive care, being fed through a tube and only being able to breathe via a ventilator. Staff had never seen such injuries. Burns covered 25% of Van Dongen's body, and much of the damaged skin had to be surgically removed. His face was massively scarred. He lost the sight in his left eye and most of the sight in his right. His lower left leg had to be amputated, and the sulfuric acid had eaten its way through his body, through muscle and fascia and into his bones, leaving holes in his bones that would go on to cause him indescribable agony in his everyday life. 4 months later, once he had awoken from the coma, it was found that he only had movement in his mouth and tongue and was paralyzed from the neck down. At first, he couldn't even speak, having to communicate by sticking out his tongue when his father pointed to a letter on an alphabet board. His father commented, "I stayed by his bedside all the time. It went very bad. At one point, he no longer responded to anything. He seemed to be falling into a hole. I stood by his ear and I shouted really loudly. He seemed to come back." Eventually, he regained the power of speech through a speaking valve, but was paralyzed from the neck down. As Mark lay in hospital, police launched an investigation into the case and very quickly established a chain of events. They found that in August 2015, the relationship had broken down and Van Dongen began seeing another woman. On the 2nd of September 2015, Wallace bought a 1-litre bottle of sulfuric acid online through Amazon. She removed the label and began to research acid attacks. It is also found that she told a counsellor she felt she could destroy everything around her when someone spoke out of turn. Police records established that on the day she bought the acid, Van Dongen had dialed 999 and told police that Wallace had been harassing him and his new girlfriend. It was then that a constable had phoned Wallace and warned her under the Protection from Harassment Act to stop harassing Mark and Violet. It was not until 10 months after the attack in July 2016 that Van Dongen was able to fill in the blanks with police, illustrating how he had gone to the flat that night, how they had had a disagreement, and then after falling asleep, Wallace had woken him and thrown the acid on him. Of course, this strengthened the case against Wallace completely. Slowly, Mark's condition improved slightly. He regained his speech, but not any movement below the neck. However, he was diagnosed with depression. He would get agitated, abusive, and angry with staff. He was unable to feed or wash himself or use a toilet. Sometimes he said that he wanted to live, and at other times that he would prefer to die. By November 2016, 29 specialists had been involved in his care at the Southmead, and it was clear that Van Dongen would need a lifetime of constant and dedicated care, and so a care home in Gloucester was found for him. He moved there on the 22nd of November 2016. His father said, "I asked Mark, would you like me to help you with the transfer?" Mark said, "Dad, I would like to do it myself, so at least I have got that bit of independence." Cornelius Van Dongen then returned to Belgium. The very next day after going into his care home, Mark rang his father in a distressed state. He said, "Dad, please come back here and get me." His father, of course, as any father would, drove straight to Gloucester and upon arriving found his son in a horrific state. Mark lay there, covered in his own feces and completely distraught. Cornelius then washed his son down, cleaned him up, and upon doing so, Mark said to his dad, "I'm coming with you to Belgium." So his dad said that he would work it out. In order to transport Mark from the UK to Belgium, Mark's family and friends had teamed up and hired a private ambulance, which drove to Gloucester and picked Mark up, taking him back to Belgium to the St. Maria Hospital in Overpelt. In Belgium, it was said that although doctors and nurses were at first overwhelmed at St. Maria Hospital, they admitted him and took him to a palliative care unit, where he was given excellent care. Mark's dad, Cornelius, then asked Mark if he would like to come home to his house. But Mark, by this time, was becoming very cynical about his life prospects and had replied, "Dad, it would just be another ceiling to look at." Whilst in hospital, Mark developed a chest infection that required a tube to be inserted into his throat to remove the fluid building up. The doctors informed him that this would most certainly have meant him losing his voice. This was the last straw, it seemed, for Mark, and unable to face the thought of his last facet of normality being taken away, he decided that he would apply for euthanasia. In Belgium, euthanasia is completely legal, and in cases such as this, people can apply for the right to end their own life rather than carry on suffering the torment of what could be seen as being trapped in their own bodies. And so, on December the 1st, 2016, Mark put in an application to go through the process of euthanasia. He was then examined by 3 consultants who confirmed that this was, in their terms, a case of unbearable physical and psychological suffering, and they agreed that he met the criteria for euthanasia under Belgian law. "No one wants to live like that," his father said. "I no longer left his bedside. He was constantly itching. I had to support his arm, try to relieve the nerve pain. There is membranes around the bones. It was all full of holes. The sulfuric acid continued to burn. It was unbearable pain." On the 2nd of January 2017, Mark Van Dongen and his father spent the day talking. His father said, "Mark was actually quite positive. They wanted to take me out. Mark said, 'No, I want my dad to accompany me on my last journey.'" At 7:15 p.m, doctors checked he was absolutely sure and that all laws had been followed. A doctor came, they inserted a catheter into his heart, and that was the end of my son. On January the 2nd, 2017, Mark exercised the ultimate level of control over his own life and made the brave choice to take his own life through the process of euthanasia, all because of the callous actions of a jealous, vindictive, and evil woman. On February the 3rd, 2017, Wallace was charged with the murder of Mark Van Dongen after it was said that it was her actions on that fateful night that led to Mark's life-changing injuries and his decision to apply for euthanasia. On November the 8th, Wallace goes on trial, and on November 15th, her legal team makes an application of no case to answer on the murder charge, explaining that Mark died at the hands of doctors in Belgium, not by the hand of Wallace. So she couldn't be guilty of his murder. On November the 20th, Miss Justice May dismissed the murder charge and the prosecution appealed the decision at the Court of Appeal. On March 29th, 2018, the Court of Appeal judges rule the murder charge should remain. And so, on April the 23rd, a jury is sworn in at Bristol Crown Court and Wallace's trial begins. Throughout the trial, Wallace makes an attempt to showcase Mark as the abuser, claiming he would shout at her and hit her, and that the reason the acid was to hand on the night in question was because he had filled her a glass of it, pretending it was water, in the hope that she would drink it in the night and that it would cause her death. She even tried to pretend that she had believed she was throwing water onto Mark and not sulfuric acid. But throughout the trial, her lies and deceit were unravelled, as it was shown that she had planned her actions in full. From purchasing the acid itself on the 2nd of September to researching acid attacks and what happens to people who drink sulfuric acid. It was even found that Belinda had researched a case in the Daily Telegraph that discussed the trial of a man that was alleged to have forced or tricked his girlfriend to drink a glass of sulfuric acid, that she then used as her defence in the trial itself. Luckily, to a large degree, the jury saw through her deceit, and on May the 17th, Wallace was acquitted of murder but convicted of throwing a corrosive substance with intent. And on May 23rd, 2018, Wallace was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. Miss Justice Nicola Davies, the trial judge, called the attack premeditated, sadistic, malicious and callous, branding Wallace manipulative, controlling and dangerous. She told her, "Your intention was to burn, disfigure and disable Mark Dongen so that he would not be attractive to any other woman. It was an act of pure evil." She said that Van Dongen was targeted by Wallace when he was vulnerable and almost naked. Her focus was his face and then his body. Wallace sat in the dock showing little emotion as the judge detailed the catastrophic and life-changing injuries Van Dongen had suffered, as well as the emotional and psychological damage. She said Wallace told lie upon lie about what had happened and sought to destroy Van Dongen's name and character by claiming he was abusive. The judge said Van Dongen was frightened of Wallace and was right to be so. She said you chose your moment for the attack. It occurred when Mark Van Dongen, wearing only boxer shorts, was asleep in the bed which you had shared in your flat. Vulnerable, almost naked, he awoke but had no real opportunity to avoid the focus of your acid attack, namely his face and body. Outside court, Mark's father, Cornelius Van Dongen, said that the minimum term was not long enough and argued she should never be released. He said, "I am very pleased she is going to be locked up for 12 years, but really this is too little, as we as a family have been sentenced for life. I hope she messes up and doesn't ever come out of prison again. There are only losers in this case. This has completely ruined our lives, financially and as a family. Our home has fallen apart. I hope that we can start to pick up the pieces and rebuild." So, what do you think? Do you believe that Belinda Wallace was given the correct level of punishment? Should she have been charged with Mark's murder? Or should she have been given a much longer sentence? Put your thoughts in the comments below and I will be putting my own thoughts on the case in there too. Now, if you enjoyed watching this video, you might also enjoy this next video displayed on screen now, where I talk about 12 deadly, dastardly and evil women who were jailed for murder in 2024, and you wouldn't believe some of their crimes. And once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one when it will once again be time for more true crime.